Welcome back, everyone. Knowledge Unbound. We're back here again. Same time, same place. I guess it's not same time, same place because I don't know when you load up each episode. I'm just glad that you do. Knowledge Unbound brought to you by the Rios Institute, funded by the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Segev, how we doing?
We're doing great. Another episode, another topic, another university.
Another university, not global this time, but I did travel to University of New Mexico to record this one, even though Dr. Madison is actually now at Rutgers University. So she moved there soon after we did this. Not because we did this, but it just so happened. And this is a good one, and I feel a little bad because I wanted to talk to a guest about disability in higher ed for quite some time. Not making excuses, just, I get my guests, and I was just so fortunate to connect with Dr. Madison. We were on a panel together some time ago, and I reached out to her just as a cold email. Hey, I'm running this podcast. You think you may be willing to talk to me? And she was gracious, and we had a great conversation. And we had a good time too, New Mexico. I'd never actually been to that state before I went to interview her. Have you been?
No, but I'm guessing you've never made that left turn in Albuquerque.
I don't know what you're talking about.
That's a Looney Tunes reference for anyone who still watches that.
Oh, Jesus Christ, dude. Wow.
My inner child still exists.
I mean, I grew up with that, but I didn't think to bring that up right
Bugs Bunny reference for the record.
You know what? You need to stop. Guys, enjoy this episode. Dr. Madison, Brian Dewsbury here, Segav, I'm a side producer. We had a good time talking about this. See you at the end. What we tend to do with this podcast is I don't like to go through like the long introduction. This is where you're from. I want you to tell your story. I know you're an anthropologist by training. You've done some really, really interesting work with gender and social structures in China. And now I know you're transitioning into taking on accessibility research and anthropology much more directly. Mm-hmm. Could you tell us, just by way of your own journey, where did this all start for Siobhan? Like, why China? Why anthropology? And how have you walked now into this really area of critical need?
Oh, well, first of all, thank you for having me, Brian. This is amazing. I think everybody who came out of our short interaction was really excited to talk to you, actually. So I feel very fortunate to be here. And my journey, gosh, that's a hard question. I feel like I could start in so many different places, but where to start with this?
Anywhere you want.
Yeah, I think I'm in a place right now where I'm really interested in understanding how people's personal journeys in life that are not scholarly impact what they choose to study and how they interpret the things that they study. And I grew up, I'm just going to start at the beginning. I grew up in a family that was Irish Catholic. That's kind of the identity.
Mm-hmm. The Siobhan gave it away.
And this family was one that was pretty, I don't know. Yeah, I don't want to say sexist exactly, because I had a very strong maternal figure. She was the breadwinner for our family, but we kind of grew up with that kind of set of ideals, right? That was very much in line with the nuclear family, where the male is supposed to be the breadwinner, much like most of America assumes this is the one sort of natural family type. And I started in undergraduate interested actually in neurobiology, not in anthropology. And I took a class in neuro, and they forced a pairing between neurobiology and animal behavior.
Where was this?
Cornell.
Okay.
And I went into the animal behavior class, and they started talking about theories that related to what we called sex-biased parental investment when you would invest in a daughter versus a son. And I was really taken by this area of research, that there was some like evolutionary underpinning explanation for why parents would like daughters versus sons. I think for me, there's a personal story that made that question really interesting. I'll just put it that way.
Yeah.
And anyway, I started getting really into that research. And when I went to graduate school at University of Washington, I said I was going to apply this theory to understanding humanity. My supervisor, Eric Smith, basically told me it was played out that people had done it.
That, yeah.
And so I needed to put some twist on it. And then I ended up working in China with a population, Moso people, who are matrilineal. You probably know something about this.
I do a little bit, but it's not my research, it's yours.
But like Caribbean families, right, are supposed to have kind of a very strong, like maternal sort of perspective, right? Like women are supposed to be more central. We can talk about that.
Yeah, well, let's actually talk about it now just a little bit, because when I was reading some of your work in preparation for this, now obviously growing up in Trinidad, I didn't grow up as an anthropologist, so I'm not at 16 years old saying this is clearly a matrilineal pattern of, right? But you understand who holds the cards in this sort of extended family situation, right?
Good way of putting it.
And what was interesting about it is, in terms of employment, there was some of that, a lot of the males were the ones who were the breadwinners, so to speak, but that was a different niche to the people who held like power and decision making, and who kind of set the tone for what cultural expectations and behavior was supposed to look like, right? And so I had never thought of the two things as separate until I actually read your work, to be honest. Like, I knew it implicitly, right? Because that is what my experience was, but it was interesting to just see it articulated. So anyway, thanks for that.
No, that's a beautiful way of putting it. I think first of all, you're totally an anthropologist because you're making these observations about your life. Every human is an anthropologist. That's what I think. If you think about humans, you're basically an anthropologist. And it's complicated, isn't it? It's so tempting to want to put like human societies into some box, right, where we say they're matrilineal or they're patrilineal or whatever. And the reality is just like what you're saying. Somebody can be the breadwinner, but decision making it's joint, right? The power is jointly held. It's just that one person is in a position where if people are not in agreement, which often they are, that they kind of hold sway.
Yeah.
Anyway, I ended up working with Moso people because they're matrilineal, but they're one of the only societies in the world that also has a patrilineal counterpart, where they share the same language. They have all of these rites of passage in common. Most importantly, they identify as a unified ethnic group, right? Everybody calls themselves Moso. But in one case, they're matrilineal. This is the most famous group. People don't get married there traditionally. And men kind of come and go, and women are at the center of decision making and child rearing and all the things women do everywhere. They're just in a position to kind of, be in control of their own outcomes, which isn't true everywhere.
Right.
Women always do all the work, in my opinion. It's just whether they, get to sort of determine whether they hold on to the fruits of their labor, and they do in the matrilineal case. And anyway, this was a better place for me to do my work, according to my advisors, because you could do this comparison between the matrilineal Moso people and patrilineal Moso people, and then you knew when you had a difference between those groups, you could sort of isolate gender norms as a reason for those differences. So that's the work I'm probably the best known for, is kind of these matrilineal, patrilineal comparisons, trying to understand why humans, not a small fraction of the time, decide to invest in women and girls and not in boys and men, which is what we as Euro-Americans think is normal.
So I want to ask you one more question about your research. And I don't know if this is a little past what your research questions have been. But one of the things that was sitting with me as I read through your work is, I guess, the current conversation, like today's conversation around masculinity. And you know, the entire spectrum of it, right? So a group who kind of laments the development of that term I don't love, but they use it a lot, toxic masculinity. But then there's other ways in which masculinity is exampled for young men, right? And I just wondered to some extent what your own research, your own experience, how that has come to inform perhaps how you see that conversation playing out in the current day.
Tell me more about why you don't like the term toxic masculinity.
Because, so when I say I don't like, doesn't necessarily mean I disagree with it. But what I don't like about it perhaps is maybe the context within which I've heard it used, where I worry that such a broad brush is being placed across a whole group that doesn't give them a path to redemption, right? So I'm okay with sort of pointing out, you know, there are some fundamental things in how manhood and masculinity is conceived that needs addressing. Where I struggle a little bit is that sometimes I see the people who are doing the pointing out not willing to do the addressing. And if you're not willing to do that second step, then you're giving them sort of no path to redemption. And the problem is now in that gap steps in people who offer them a particular version, which is not necessarily a good version. It's just a version. And, you know, part of it too is the people who are stepping into that void are not people like yourself who are actually researchers, right? Like who have a sophisticated understanding of what it looks like culturally in different contexts, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess I'm just leaning into, you know, the conversations I've seen you've had in your professional world and wondering how that has impacted your thoughts on this.
Oh, it's such a hard question, and I think your thoughts are so much.
I'm known for that. Sorry.
I think your thoughts are so much more nuanced, like you're saying, than this conversation is kind of nationally, right? And I'm a mother of two boys, like you are, and I hear you. There's this kind of balance between recognizing the centrality of women and womanhood to humanity, which in this society we don't do very well, in my opinion, and then blaming men for you know, this kind of two-dimensional and incorrect representation and enactment of what we think society is supposed to be like. And those are two separate things. We were talking this morning with a friend of mine about how women are also complicit, right, in shaping these kind of problematic gender relations. So the question's difficult for me because toxic masculinity is a thing, and there are a lot of men who are toxically masculine. You know these guys. You know, they're everywhere right now. And then there are the ways that we operate, you know, in performing our genders within a space where toxic masculinity is accepted.
Right.
And female centrality is rejected.
I'll give you an example.
Yeah.
I don't know if I can call this benign because I actually think it's a thing.
Yeah.
So like you, I have two boys, right? My younger one, he's in second grade. It took me a couple of seconds. It's hard to keep track sometimes. But when he was in kindergarten, I believe, right? He had a teacher who was just like crafts on steroids, right? Like every week it was something, and send pictures and this and that. And it was overall it was good because she loves the kids and she loved having them do stuff, right? But they had a joint Father's Day and Mother's Day celebration. So the same day they invited both parents to come to class for this thing, right? Now, okay, first of all, why would you assume that at 10 a.m. parents are free enough to come in and do a thing? Anyway, but that's a whole separate conversation. But what was interesting with the presentation is they had videos of each child saying, give me examples of why my daddy is strong. And give me examples of why my mommy is caring. Right? So literally stating it outright at 5 or whatever, however old they are, right? And it's interesting just watching this, right? Now, I didn't do the, I don't know, maybe I should have, right? I didn't do the like, this is terrible, you shouldn't be enforcing these norms from this age. But you see it, right? You see how, again, this is not like straight up toxicity we're talking about, but just kind of setting up this pathway of these are the social expectations of your sex.
Totally.
And that's kind of what I'm getting at, like how this stuff is kind of begins from that age.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know what to say here exactly, if I'm being honest. Like, I think studying gender in a context where gender is hypothetically, performed in different ways was so illuminating to me, because even though the norms around power are different in the matrilineal and patrilineal context, I still feel like men and women observe those same roles. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
And we don't talk about women being powerful. We just don't do that. And that doesn't happen there either. I think people talk about men are always the powerful. They're not, I don't want to say things in that black and white way, but men are often the powerful sex, right? I think you're asking me such hard questions that I haven't had enough time to think about.
Last time I say yes to you to come on the podcast, right?
They're just, I think there's a much more nuanced version of this that eventually I'm going to write about in a book, I think, because I'm still sort of processing it myself. But I think, like, to achieve some kind of space where we don't have these hostile gender interactions, you have to have egalitarianism. Not a space that's matriarchal or matrilineal or patriarchal or patrilineal, but it has to come from a space where we value the things that each gender and everyone along the gender spectrum provides.
Yeah.
And where we recognize the overlaps as much as we recognize the things that separate the genders. You know what I mean?
I know it 100%, and we can talk about this for hours. I hope I can bring you back when you write that book, because I have so much follow-up questions, all good ones, right? But I think part of the reason I'm pressing you on this is because A, I know you've studied it. B, you talked about how your personal experience informed your choice to go in that direction, and C, I think people like yourself have a lot to offer as we collectively try to understand this, right? The question wasn't meant to be like, oh, this is the right answer, wrong answer, right? It's more, I think as a nation, we actually, if we are honest, I think we're actually still wrestling with some of those same questions.
Absolutely.
Let me pivot a little bit, because some of the articles that you have written recently has talked explicitly about your move into accessibility research. You can say specific to anthropology, but I can imagine that some of the things that you're interested in would be applicable to several other disciplines who themselves are struggling with this question. I read a very brave essay, if I can call it that, about a major diagnosis that you had in 2020. So I'm bringing this up only because you've semi-talked about it publicly.
Sure.
So I'm just wondering if you're willing to share that part of your journey from when the diagnosis happened, all the sort of the thoughts that swirled during that period, and how that then led to perhaps a career pivot to focus on a different issue.
Yeah, I got sick over a number of years. I would say actually starting closer to 2016. As you said, I'm an anthropologist and I do field work as that's part of my beat. And I work both in rural China in a fairly removed place that we've talked about, but also in the South Pacific. And I was out there in 2016 with my husband and my 2 kids. And we got sick. And my little kid, we were in a very remote part. I remember this because I was calling my friend here who was an emergency room doctor and asking her how to manage what was going on because we didn't have the resources locally, which is a whole other conversation, healthcare equity and stuff like that. But my son got really, really sick, like 104-degree fever. We've never experienced this since. Pox all over his face. It was terrifying. He was only 11 and a half months at the time. It was really awful. And I was breastfeeding him, and we were just sick together in this space under a mosquito net, just trying not to get, just to be well, I guess I would say, right?
Yeah.
And anyway, we came back to the United States. We sort of got through that episode, and he got better, and I just started getting progressively a little bit worse, and very slowly over time, where initially I'd have feeling of pins and needles in my leg or something like that. And then starting in 2019, my mobility changed. I had gone from being able to run like a half marathon to just kind of slowing down. I could do only 6 miles and then 5 miles, then 4 miles and whatever. And I took this position at the National Science Foundation and moved out to Virginia. And I don't know exactly why. Maybe it was the stress of everything that was going on, but the pace of decline increased a lot. We have a mutual friend, Alistair Abraham. He and I lived in the same neighborhood in Virginia, and he and I came down with these mobility issues at kind of the same time. And we were talking about this at one point. Like, I'd just be walking around the neighborhood because that's what I did for exercise. And gradually, he'd be looking out of his window and he'd see me walking less and less because I just couldn't move in the same way. And it got so bad at one point that I could not walk beyond my driveway. Like, I was in a wheelchair often.
So during this time of decline,
yeah,
because it sounds like it was over a several-year period.
Yes.
Were you checking in with physicians
Of
as
course.
to what the hell?
Of course. And I couldn't get help. I was in New Mexico, again, healthcare inequities. And I couldn't get the diagnosis here, and I wasn't bad enough. It's like you have to get really bad before people start taking you seriously. And then when we moved to DC, I was really fortunate, I think, to be in a position where the doctors were willing to work with me and figure out what was happening. So anyway, I ended up being diagnosed with what's, myasthenia gravis, MG, which is a rare disease.
The autoimmune disease, right?
Autoimmune disease, exactly. Working with a doctor who I would go Dr. PubMeding. I don't call myself a Dr. Googler. I don't do that. I go straight to the NIH PubMed sources. You know what I mean? And anyway, I found all of these different antibodies that were associated with myasthenia gravis, and I asked him to check for them. And I was positive for one of them, not the typical one. And he diagnosed me. And gradually, over a period of a couple years, he started treating me according to the standard protocol for MG. And then I stabilized.
Okay.
This was extremely humbling for me. I think in the essay I said this too, before MG, I was such an ableist. I really believe this. I think academia is inherently ableist. And that's kind of why we're talking today, right? That's the actual pretense of our conversation. That I was in this space where I felt like the person who produced more was better.
Right.
That if you couldn't play the game, then you should just get out, all this stuff.
Right.
And I think as a result of being sick and chronically disabled. I still can't. I'm stable now, but I can't do the things that I was able to do before I got this diagnosis. And it's just pivoted. It's been a huge pivot for me in my personal life, and then academically trying to understand both in a scholarly way how disability fits in with, sort of in the range of natural human variation, because we don't talk about that in anthropology, in bioanth specifically, but also in academic spaces.
Bioanth is
biological anthro.
Okay, I'm sorry.
Yes.
I didn't know the.
You and I are both biologists underneath
I know,
everything.
and I could have context clues it.
But bioanthros don't really talk about disability very much, right?
Yeah.
We make all of our inferences about humanity, and we're in a very powerful place, I think, to interpret those things for the public, right? When we talk about humans being endurance runners or something like that, right? It is based on a very small sample.
Right.
A really tiny slice of humanity.
Maasai.
For example, Maasai,
right.
people in South Africa or Southern Africa, Southeastern Africa, or people in Mexico, Tarahumara. There's lots of research on runners. But it's almost like you select these populations where people have to be mobile to do what they need to do to subsist. And then we say, this is what humans, this is what we do. And if you're outside that range of variation, sorry.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is a lighter point, right? But every time I watch the Olympics, marathons is one of the things I watch just because I'm fascinated by somebody who can do a 5-minute mile for that long. I mean, I just can't even,
Yeah.
And I say, look, I could meet them at the last 100 meters.
That's pretty good.
And
actually.
no. Hear me out. I can go to the race. I just show up, not run the race, but just meet them for the last 100 meters of the race and start at that point. And they will still beat me. I wouldn't even be close, right? This is how ridiculous it is. But the bigger point I'm making here is, to your point, this is a very small subsection. Like most regular people, like this is out of range for 99% of us. Right. But then that small sample is being used to say, hey, look how great humans are.
Right. Exactly. It's exactly that. And I think both you and I want to hear your story. You've probably shared it before, but I just think, like, when you're in this space of being different, it makes you want to understand how you fit in. And we are just researchers. We have education. We have the tools to study that in a systematic way, ideally without bias and all that stuff that other people don't have, right? So it's now reshaping what I want to do as an academic. I hope to build in the spring the first fully accessible biological anthropology lab. And there's part of me that's so proud of being in a position to do that. And there's part of me that's just so sad that it's 2025 when this first thing shows up, you know? And even then I can only do it in the most limited way. I've been having these conversations with our mutual friend Logan Jin, Brad Duerstock, people who are famous for accessibility and bench work, or Anita Marshall, accessible field work, trying to figure out how to make that the norm for our discipline, as opposed to something that's this fringe accessible space or whatever. And it's hard. It's really hard. I don't know. I can't anticipate the range of needs for different people. So I have to be in a position where I can be flexible. But when you're building a lab, you're having conversations about, how much bench space you need, where the open parts of the floor are, whether you need door actuators, obviously, on as many doors as possible, whether things need to be at sort of wheelchair height or higher. And it's one person needs this thing, another person needs something else. And I can't know all of that. And I feel like I'm building it from scratch. And that part is really it's humbling, it's powerful, it's all these things, but it's frustrating too. I feel like that like the world should be there at the baseline, and I shouldn't have to work so hard to create it, you know?
Yeah.
Anyway, so I'm interested in this in terms of scholarship. Like, where do disabled people who are like at least 30% of the population, we're all going to be there at one point or another. Where do we fit in? What does that mean about all the inferences that we've drawn about humans? Are the energetics different? Are the roles for men and women different than the things that we've been saying?
Yeah, so it sort of fits into these questions you were asking before in a certain
Absolutely.
way.
Yeah. And then I think kind of overlapping with some of the stuff that you do, like trying to understand what this means about the academic space and how we do our work and who we include in the conversations of how we create knowledge, right?
Right.
Like, I want to know your story, and I don't know if this is the time for that, but there's something similar, right? That pushed you into this space.
I'm not ducking the question. I am going to respond in a second, but I just want to ask you two quick things because it's so directly connected to what you just said. I feel I have to ask it now. This is not to absolve academia in any way, right? But one of the things I remember coming to terms with one time when I fractured my ankle and I was wheelchair for 2 weeks, right? And again, small inconvenience compared to other things, but just how much things I took for granted, like what it meant to get up at 1 a.m. I need to go to the bathroom and have to like figure that out, like navigate that, right? So all these things that was just automatic in my life was now a real challenge. And one of the things with privilege is a lot of times you don't recognize that you have it until you don't have it, right? So the ability to do these things. And so now I'm thinking in terms of your mission here to become to make academia more aware. Is the awareness challenge here to get people to see something that they're not obliged to see because the system is not set up for them to have to see it? I don't know how else to put that question. So for those who are able, and by those I don't necessarily mean individuals, but whole systems really, who can move around the world without having to navigate, I guess there's two things. The challenges that might be brought about by disability, but then also the challenges that are brought about because the system is set up in such a way that there are challenges, right? So there's some sort of education / awareness that comes with this, which is, I feel would be difficult for people, again, who this just hasn't been their world, unless they personally had the experience or they know somebody really close to. Has that been something you've encountered in the early days of your work in this space?
Every day. I wish it were just the early days. It's every day.
Yeah.
You know, even what you're talking about, a person who has like an injury for a couple of weeks and comes back, because we've all had that, right? Everybody's had some kind of surgery or whatever, like your parents have been in that situation and you've had to take a couple of weeks off work and navigate things differently. Everyone's experienced that. What people can't deal with in academia is the persistence of that stuff. And the system isn't designed for that. So it's a constant battle. You know, you say you don't want to absolve academia of its contributions to these problems. And I just don't think absolution is ever in the cards. I think academia is one of the direct perpetrators of these inequitable spaces in every way. And one thing I would like to talk about with you, given that we work in sort of different spaces of marginalization, right, is how much overlap there is. These are distinct spaces, but there's just an overlap too, right, between how we anticipate people who are or are not like us contributing to the creation of knowledge, which is the academic enterprise. And disability is one space that I think has been very much neglected by mainstream academics. Clearly, there are people who've been working in this for a long time. But most of us are completely unaware of this space. Until I got sick, I had never heard the term universal design. I'd never heard the phrase inclusive design. And then I had to start paying attention to it because it affected me, right?
Right.
So I don't know how to answer your question.
Yeah.
I think I think academia kind of creates this problem in the sense that we are among the most powerful people to create a space where that is not a problem. And yet we insist on metricizing people's human and productive worth. In a way that does not allow for that variation, that very human variation, right?
So I'm going to ask one question, and that will kind of segue into me answering your question from earlier. I'm not going to necessarily assume that everybody who gets a disability or feels some sort of marginalization has to then go on and do research or any kind of programming around it. But you are going to. And so that's a choice, and it's a choice I love. This is why I want to talk to you. What's the imagination going on inside that says this is now my calling? Because you could have said this has happened to me and I'm going to live with this and be the best anthropologist I can and deal with the shitty system, right? But you're taking that a step further. And so I'm curious as to why that step further choice is made. How would you explain that?
I would need many hours to get at the many layers of that answer.
Give me one layer.
Why are you an academic, Brian?
I told you I'll answer you after you answer me, I promise.
But that's a different question. Why are you an academic? Why did you choose to be in a position of creating knowledge? Why is that what you want to do?
So initially, that's not what I wanted to do. Okay, so I'll break my own rules and answer your question. Initially, I grew up kind of a hippie. I don't know. I didn't know the term until I came to the U.S., right? Okay. But I was a kind of environment, nature loving. I was the kid who brought the worms in the house and all kind of stuff. So when I went to college, the goal was to do conservation, and conservation from the very protect the environment kind of thing. So when I went to grad school, I only went to grad school because undergrad professor said, well, if you want to protect the environment, you need to understand how this works, because you can't just protect it as is. There's a reason why it looks that way. You need to understand that. And the fact that I fell in love with teaching was complete serendipity, right? I was actively advised to avoid the classroom. But when I taught, and I only did it because there was a requirement, and I tried to do it early to get it out of the way, I basically fell in love. And when you fall in love like that, you can't. It's a feeling that you have to sit with for some time and fully process what goes into it, because what goes into it is not just what happened in that semester or that one class. It's years and years and years of things that were building up, that you were ignoring, that you don't understand yourself, right? And so with age comes the blessing of being able to put words to some of the feelings that you had, right? So I'm the son of a pastor, right? I grew up in a community that was very much about uplift, about, you can rise above your circumstances, you have a lot to give to the world, you live beyond yourself. And so his approach, and even though I don't practice Christianity anymore, but his approach was one of, your calling in this world is to be of service to others, right? And when I taught that class, that's the feeling I got. For whatever reason, there was some transformation happening in that interaction I was having with those students that had nothing to do with biology, that had nothing to do with the textbook, had nothing to do with the exams. It was about looking out there and seeing a world that you could impact in a way that you didn't even know was possible. And that's a love I couldn't walk away from. So my recommitment, I should say, to academia at that point was a recommitment to the possibility and the aspiration of seeking knowledge, but seeking knowledge about what teaching, curriculum design, the education process, the system, how we can set this whole thing up so that whoever we have the blessing to come into our classrooms or our campuses, they can walk away understanding that beauty, right?
Mm-hmm.
But that light, that Damascus moment happened at 34, right? Like that's in my third degree. Like I'm just coming to terms with that. So I'm sure you have a similarly long answer, right? But I'll say one more thing before I pass the mic back to you. I do and write a lot about marginalization, right? But there's a bigger overarching thing I am more obsessed with, right? And that is this notion of what it means to be human, what it means to live in a society where you all have to figure out how to survive, thrive, love each other, not kill each other, come to hard decisions together, right? And I truly believe the classroom and the college campus can and should be a place where you get formative practice in that process, right? Mm-hmm. So when I speak about marginalization, I speak about it within the context, not necessarily about righting wrongs, but more about like redesigning a whole process so that going forward, you don't repeat this mistake, right? Mm-hmm. And that's just a slightly different way of approaching it than, you all are bad people and you should repent for your sins, right? So like you, I mostly came to disability research as a practitioner, right? So students would come to me, would need services, and so what I had done, even as a grad student, is I spent a lot of time with the Disability Services Office, and they gave me books to read. And so again, then I wasn't publishing and stuff like that, but I just wanted to do better, right? And my wife taught K-12 for 18 years, and one of the things that I learned from her was inclusion actually started in K-12 with this notion that you have a class and you have differentiated learners and you needed to find a way to include them in the classroom. So they actually started that whole process, right? It kind of got lost in the ether. And I would still consider myself kind of growing in that space, right? Yeah. I hope that answers your question in a roundabout way, but yes, we all have a nuanced journey.
I love that answer. You have such a positive framing. I do. I think you're like such an important voice for this space because, what you're saying just so fits with your profile. And I don't even know you that well, but I felt this in our mutual interaction too, where we were on that panel together. You just have this ability to kind of like you're productive. You're not deconstructive. And I think that you need all of that really in this space. But that voice is one that I think is especially successful in helping people to understand where their journey needs to go. I'm a little like earlier in my journey, I think, and maybe there is a phase, like you have to go through the 7 phases of whatever, grief, anger, blah, blah, blah. And I think I'm maybe a little bit more in the angry space right now, if I'm being honest.
No, dude.
And I think, I can't even remember what question.
I'll remind you because it's an important one. My question was that you made the choice to go beyond. And start this project. This is an important project. And I know you said there were several layers to it, but you promised to share at least 1 or 2 with us.
Have you ever had people cry on your podcast? Because that's how I feel. You're asking me such hard questions and they're too deep.
HR, please log off right now.
I think it's a calling and it's a gift, and I don't choose this. It chose me.
Right.
We are in this position of power and service. It's exactly what you said. It's service, where we have to serve the greater purpose. It's just something bigger than ourselves. Everyone should be enabled, empowered to do that. And we have been lucky enough to arrive in the space where we can do that for other people. I don't think it's a choice. It's a calling,
Yeah. I'm going to build on that with another question. You sort of hinted at this, but maybe weren't very explicit. So in the same way have this almost aspirational view of what the classroom could be. That aspiration is not just limited to classroom, right? It is something I think anybody who is employed within our institution can and should embody, right? Regardless of what their function is, right? And there are ways in which your individual tasks can dovetail from that vision. And I sadly look around too often and see academics, perhaps through no fault of their own, were brought into a system where you kind of got trapped into a plantation and didn't realize it, right? So you know, it tell you as a grad student, oh, when you become a professor, you could be creative, blah, blah, blah. When you become an assistant professor, just get tenure. Just get some stuff out, 3 papers a year, whatever. Then when you get tenured, you can, you know,
right.
When you become associate, you know, you have to get full in 5 years because otherwise you're not a serious academic, you know, and of course now there's post-tenure review, etc. And when you become full, like, why aren't you a chair? So you can spend so much many years of your career like chasing after this elusive thing without really pausing and asking yourself, but why? Like why? I have been granted this space to ask questions of the world. Do the questions need to be the same in year 10 and in year 1? Right? As more important issues arise, do I not have the freedom to go after these things? And I see so much fear.
You see so much what?
Fear,
yeah.
Sorry, my Trinidadian accent makes me see that slightly differently. I wonder if there's a space in your new pathway to perhaps inspire others to relinquish. I mean, I'm not saying go, you know, throw out your lab and dump all the research questions, but like if there is space for you to get into other areas that are publicly beneficial, that are beneficial to the society, community, academia. You know, why silence yourself? And I see so much, you know, we talked about this earlier off camera, but anticipatory obedience, right? This need to kind of just play the game, play the rules, and everything will be safe. And I just feel that the luxury of that is gone. I feel the chickens have come home to roost in the kind of insular, conservative way we've approached our profession.
Yeah.
All that to say, I'm applauding what you're about to do.
Oh, thank you.
I'm behind you 100%.
Thank you. We're mutual fans.
Okay. So
how do we change that space, Brian? I want to know.
Talk about multi-layered questions. I think there are many things, right? You could probably guess by minute 55 of this, right? That are more. Well, I think so. Well, I'll get you out on this last. We're gonna ask one more question and we'll get out. That I take mostly an optimistic kind of approach to this, right? And I can put my head in the sand, especially given all of the political rhetoric around the kind of stuff we're doing. But I do think there are paths forward, right? I think what we haven't done enough, and not saying you and I, but I think in general, our community haven't done enough to go beyond the rhetoric of terms and acronyms and things like that to demonstrate with actual defensible evidence-based meanings why those things matter, right? And, you know, sometimes it's very hard to be told something about yourself or your craft from somebody with a darker purpose, but it doesn't necessarily mean that some elements of what they're saying is untrue. So we have to be brave and professionally humble enough to look in the mirror and say, we didn't do good enough. So to be more specific, I think projects like yours, because there needs to be a proof of principle and people who kind of willing to foray in that space. I think one of your papers about the Masu, so I'm pronouncing the name incorrectly.
I do too. It's Chinese. I can't do it either.
but your paper was talking about you were one of the first to provide evidence of the role of the father. You know, so I think that sort of mindset of let's kind of stay away from the word wars and get to actually evidence of impact of why these things matter. And I think that discipline we have to look in the mirror and say we weren't disciplined in many cases. That's in a nutshell. There's more to it, but that in a nutshell for me is the path forward that I'm trying to be more aggressive about.
Brian, I'm going to provide the angry version of what you just said.
Go for it.
Which is that I think academia is built by elitists I don't know enough about this history to know this for sure, but like, I don't know if you've read the book Why Fish Don't Exist. You know, they talk about the origin of Stanford University. And it's such an elitist space. You know, it's all these like white men who were extremely wealthy, and they're building on their social networks to generate the capital to put together an institution where they get to preach their version of whatever they're interested in to the next generation. And there's something really beautiful in that I think you're kind of touching on. Like, teaching is such a beautiful thing to be able to do. But there's a closedness about the origin. And that origin, like we're the worst fundamentalists of all, you know? All the stuff that we do, like, you know, how many papers we need to write a year before we get tenure or promoted, what spaces we're allowed and not allowed to talk about. God, like hooding at PhD ceremonies. There's so much weird stuff in there that is a little bit like hazy and elitist. And I think so much of that problem, you know, that persists, many of the problems that persist in academia have that origin. It comes from privilege. It comes from the privilege of being a man, from the privilege of your skin color, and from the privilege of being able-bodied. It just does. And we have to question those origins. We have to be a little bit angry about those origins. Yeah. Because if we don't understand where it comes from and we just accept precedent, we are perpetuating fundamentalism as academics, which is so ironic because we're in the strongest position to understand the evidence that supports like actually positive outcomes in the knowledge generation process. And we're not doing that. We're like the most conservative people institutionally and structurally and the loudest about being progressive. You know, it's time to walk the walk.
The irony is...
And I don't know how to do that. I don't know how to do that.
But
your questions are so real. Like, how do we have these conversations with our administrators so that we can do the work that's important, that changes how the public, you know, that changes the knowledge that we consume, that informs these really important questions about who gets to marry and what kind of families people are allowed to build, because we do that. We act as, you know, we like testify in big arguments about the nature of what laws, you know, regulate people's livelihoods. We do that. How do we put ourselves in a space where we can do that with freedom and in a way that isn't predicated on being a white, able-bodied man? You know,
that's what you're gonna help us do. I'll be there right alongside with you. I promise you that. Would you promise me to come back on my podcast when your book is out? Because I feel like there's a lot more to talk about.
100%.
All right, this is recorded, just so you know. So
I know.
If you say no,
scary.
I'm gonna come back and play this clip. Okay. Siobhan, thanks for being with us. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. It's been a joy.
Knowledge Unbound is brought to you by the Rios Institute for a racially just, inclusive, open STEM education. We are graciously funded by the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. Knowledge Unbound is produced by Mr. Segev Amansai, computer engineering major, class of 2025. Segev, how was that episode?
Very insightful. Disability in higher education. Definitely something to be looked into. Well, if I'm willing to look at myself for a little bit, I don't know how they're willing to classify autism as a disability in a way. Well, here's the thing.
I mean, I think it is, right?
Well, yeah, but it's called the autism spectrum for a reason. And I do happen to be on the more high functioning side of it, which is why I've never contacted the DRC for anything in the almost 4 years that I've been here. So
interesting. Yeah,
I mean, but definitely something to be looked into, I would say.
Well, I mean, and I think I need people to know there was no prompting on my end to make Sigef say that, because I know not everyone is willing to share that kind of personal information about themselves. So I just want to say I appreciate you, and you saying that maybe is perhaps indicative of the challenge that many students have in terms of to report and not to report, and what that sort of comes with. Like, it's not just as simply either or, it's all the psychology of it, the stigma perhaps, and
Right.
I mean, I don't want to speak for your journey, but I know, having taught many students over the years with that question, having to navigate that.
And here's the thing, it's not something, well, at least now, because I've made the effort to work on myself and be more social. It's not something that you would like instantly notice, at least with me. Granted, other people may experience it differently in their lives. I'm not saying this to say that or to, I guess, invalidate anyone's experience, because
right.
they're all
Your journey is your own.
different.
Your journey is your own. And
Essentially.
that's one of the things I loved about her interview. She kind of took us through it, right? She took us through coming to a point where she recognized what she was battling against, and not just that she had to now live her life with it, but what that journey taught her about herself, right? And I think whether you identify as somebody with a disability or not, I think there's a bigger lesson for all of us that things in life, good, bad, or in between, their value is in what it teaches us about ourselves. As you go into this week, I hope that's a lesson that sticks with you. Thank you for sticking with us. See you next week. Please be excellent to each other.
First of all, you're totally an anthropologist, because you're making these observations about your life. Every human is an anthropologist. That's what I think. If you think about humans, you're basically an anthropologist. And it's complicated, isn't it? It's so tempting to want to put like human societies into some box,
right,
where we say they're matrilineal or they're patrilineal or whatever. I think academia is one of the direct perpetrators of these inequitable spaces in every way. And one thing I would like to talk about with you, given that we work in sort of different spaces of marginalization, right, is how much overlap there is. These are distinct spaces, but there's just an overlap too, right, between how we anticipate people who are or are not like us contributing to the creation of knowledge, which is the academic enterprise. And disability is one space that I think has been very much neglected by mainstream academics. Clearly, there are people who have been working in this for a long time. But most of us are completely unaware of this space. Until I got sick, I had never heard the term universal design. I'd never heard the phrase inclusive design. And then I had to start paying attention to it because it affected me, right?
Right.
Contemplating all of my goals. Look, will I fold or will I chase them? I got adversity. Two options. I can handle it purposefully, or I can let it murder me. But sign up for war, point out the target, show me the giants. Hold your applause.